here we are on this Shakespeare Beyond Borders Alliance Equality Festival, little quick glimpse at what's happening with Shakespeare in Singapore, a territory with two perhaps special claims to significance for making Shakespeare more accessible and making Shakespeare accessible across cultures. One of them being that Singapore is a city-state entirely populated by diasporas. It's a very culturally diverse island with really nothing indigenous. So it's a place of translation, a place where there's a very confined space with many different systems of meaning, different theatre forms, different kinds of entertainment, different cultural expectations, all in a confined space where anything to do with Shakespeare is going to be translated, mediated, potentially contested. But the other striking thing about Singapore, for Shakespearean purposes, is that somebody wants to clean my hotel room. And that happens in Singapore too. But the other exciting thing about Singapore from the point of view of access to Shakespeare is that it's become a really important center globally for digital Shakespeare. And we'll be hearing about that from some very distinguished figures in the world of digital Shakespeare. Professor Yong, one of the co-founders of the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, about which we'll be hearing more, and Professor Hans-Martin Rall, a leading digital animator, originally from Germany, but who has been based in Singapore for many years now, working on some remarkable Shakespeare-based animations and virtual reality projects, which make Shakespeare available and comprehensible in contexts of Asian popular culture. But the first person whose camera I'm hoping will switch on is Dr. Eleine Ng-Gagneux, whose doctorate is a particularly good doctorate. It's from the Shakespeare Institute, and who was executive director of the World Shakespeare Congress, which would have been physically in Singapore in 2021, but which, as it turned out, was digitally in Singapore in 2021 at the height of lockdown during the pandemic. So Eleine, what sort of problems or opportunities did the Congress provide you with? Why did it seem like a good idea for the world to have it in Singapore in the first place, even at planning stage when it was going to be physical?
I think Singapore's interculturality, as you said, as a multicultural city-state and its multilingualism as well, created a unique opportunity for us to have a real conversation about global Shakespeare today. And as much as we would have liked to have it in person, having it online allowed us to allow the speakers or the panelists in a way to connect with each other earlier and before the event per se. And I think because it went digital in the end, its afterlife is also very interesting. And it also allowed us to have watch parties with directors who were not actually available to come down for the full duration of the event, but they could actually grace us for a day, for instance. And I think the watch parties for us was really a big success because, again, it opened up the dialogue between an international audience and a local director, for example.
Yeah, no, they're a fascinating genre where everybody would watch a recording of a production and then have a live Q&A session with practitioners from the production. So one of those online forms of social life and social engagement, which everybody relied on so much during those last 2 years. How is Singapore politically? What's it like as a, where does culture fit into Singapore's, really very tightly policed social organization and economic organization?
Maybe I can use the history of Shakespeare's development in Singapore to give you a sense.
Please.
Of Singapore politics and how it interacts with Singapore's theatre scene. So during the time when we gained independence, I think a lot of Singapore's politics is reflected in terms of how we use the English language, for instance. And then that ties in very much to Shakespeare's history in Singapore as well. For the first maybe 20 years, for the first 10 years, I would say from 60s to about mid 70s, we were encouraged obviously to adopt English, and then for us to, because English was seen as a language that could open up Singapore to the international public in terms of commerce. But then there was kind of a resurgence of Asian pride almost, whereby adopting too much of Western ideology became slightly problematic for the Singaporean government. So in the 80s, we were encouraged to kind of embrace local languages. And then of course, there is the colloquial Singlish as well that factored in terms of, you see that more often in being used as a vernacular in Singaporean English theatre, for instance. Kind of more experimental theatre productions, for example, SRT Singapore Repertory Theatre did R&J production that was commenting on LGBTQ plus issues, and also how the local government had quite strict rules on what could be staged in terms of censorship. So that production, I think, was able to navigate censorship guidelines because it was a Shakespearean production. But we do have quite strict censorship rules. Of course, they are slightly loosening up now as well. As you know, like foreign theatre was not allowed in the early 20th century. It was illegal to kind of stage from foreign theatre or live performance art as well. But of course now things are slightly different, especially now that Singapore is kind of positioning itself in the last 20 years as an international arts hub. So there are more and more international productions brought into Singapore.
It's in some ways a tricky aspiration for a nation state in which same-sex sexual relationships are still illegal. So Shakespearean comedy is going to be especially edgy and potentially exciting and potentially dangerous in Singapore, maybe in ways that perhaps it's become some of those scenes have perhaps become rather tame and familiar certainly in the Anglophone tradition.
I must say that in like the last 3 productions that I've watched locally in the last maybe 5 months, all of them actually managed to touch, shine some light on the different aspect of LGBT Q plus issues as well. So things definitely are changing.
We're once reminded of what happened in the early 60s in the theatre in Britain, which had always been a place of kind of alternative and refuge and expression for that community. There's a big outdoor production in Singapore every year, is there not?
Yes.
Yeah. Which seemed almost Shakespeare in the Park. Yeah. New York, except with an even more horrible climate from the point of view of outdoor. Always hot and humid, and always a risk of by lightning or absolutely drenched. Who funds that? Well, and what kind of productions does it produce?
So SIT has quite a long history of producing Shakespeare in Singapore, and it has different it produces different types of Shakespeare for different demographics of audience. They have their school productions that was very popular in the early 21st century. And then they always do a Shakespeare in the park. In fact, I think they will produce something later this year or next year that will be A Midsummer Night's Dream. I just met with one of the actors who's auditioning for that role. So I think that's on the way. They usually do that every year, but because of the pandemic, they had to take, I think, a break for the last 2 years. And I don't, usually they do quite conventional Shakespeare productions. The R&J production that I spoke about, I think that was one of their more experimental stagings of Shakespeare's work.
I seem to remember that last time I was in Singapore, which was before the pandemic, there were posters for a Julius Caesar in modern dress with a female Caesar.
Oh, okay.
Played by quite a famous local actress, I believe. It looked a lot of fun. I was sorry not to see it. Thank you, Eleine. I'm going to, please stay in the conversation. Do not switch off your camera under any circumstances, but I'm going to ask Professor Yong to switch on her camera, if she would, and manifest herself to us. Hello, Eleine. It's very good to have you on the screen, as always. And fortunately for me, you've been on my screen quite a lot this last term because we've been co-teaching my MA course simultaneously for the Shakespeare Institute and for the National University of Singapore, with students at each institution having, in effect, watch parties, watching productions and comparing notes about them, and very politely listening to us arguing about them. And that course has only been possible because of your achievement in setting up the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, this free online resource, surtitled in English or Mandarin or Korean or Japanese of Asian productions. And many thanks to Eleine for putting the website link into the chat. What was your impetus in making the enormous effort and making the huge grant applications required to bring that glorious thing into existence?
A number of people have asked me, and I find it difficult to really pin it down. I remember that, explicitly speaking, I wrote in all the grant proposals that we need a corpus, a shared corpus, because without that shared corpus, there are pockets of knowledge and pockets of creative practice within the East Asian region that don't share with each other. Taiwan doesn't know what Japan is doing, and neither of them know what Korea is doing, and all of them don't know what happens. Is there any English Shakespeare in the ex-British colonies? So I think a very practical purpose in a way was to create a shared corpus, which then also involved translating. And if you really want to do it properly, you can't just put the videos, you also have to make possible people to cross the language barrier and watch while following the dialogue as well. So in a practical and explicit way, it was for a sharing for students, practitioners, scholars, and all of them have used the archive. But maybe there was a kind of deeper sense of wanting to make it possible to include all those pockets of knowledge in some way in a larger global discourse in which I was trained. But there was a disjunct between the Shakespeare I watched and the discourse in which I was trained.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, it has completely shifted the balance in Shakespearean theatre history studies, because there isn't any comparable database, for example, for continental European Shakespeare or for English language Shakespeare. You can't go to one place and see really important productions from all over Europe, surtitled in Italian, German, French, and English or Russian. You'd have to sort of seek them out in corners, and they often remain unknown to each other unless they're productions that have toured to festivals. But
it's assumed that because there are festivals that's fine.
Yeah.
But not everyone can travel to those festivals. And in Asia, because of, it's not quite the same as Europe, where many people speak several languages. We are separated by the ocean a lot of the time, and we don't really speak each other's languages. And so it was important in that way, although a huge effort, really.
And you're now taking that effort even further by providing not only surtitles for some of the productions, but annotations that don't just translate the language, but explain a little about what the local theatre forms are that these productions are using, and what the local systems of belief are in which they're adapting and translating the Shakespeare plays, which is a huge effort.
So that's been quite fun in a way, because it has involved reimagining a very conventional thing, which is the kind of critical edition of a play where there's a lot of annotation, commentary, reference by scholars. And in this case, it will be a multimedia scholarly edition. So we have three: spirits, gender, and theatre for young audiences. So these are themes around which we will cluster. It's like we will choose 5 or 6 productions in a cluster, a comparative cluster around a theme. And what has been the fun part is that the team meets to do the commentary, so that we can show quite a few different points of view and points of entry, different fields and frameworks of knowledge can enter into a conversation together. Lately, I was in California at the Huntington Library Conference and showed some of these annotations. And the response I got was, well, of course, there's a lot of information on just a few minutes of a production and commentary from different positions. But the audience asked me, are we not going to put our names on each of the annotations and notes written? And I said, well, they're all collaboratively written. They were amazed. They said this is something that could only happen outside of America, where intellectual property is such a big deal that every single note would have to have the person's name or initials would be identifiable. And they thought it was very ideal, really, and special. And a few wanted to teach it, the production. So I offered that one of us could join and help teach. Because you and I have done quite a bit of that in the course lately. We have. That sense that you actually need a team of people to mediate these productions that have multiple cultural elements from different places. Elizabethan England, from Korea, and then Korea borrowing stuff from elsewhere too. It really helps to have people with different local knowledges all sitting around a screen, trying to explain it to one another and trying to make sense of it together. It's a very delightful activity. It's much more fun than writing notes in an ordinary edition. Which production did you show at the Huntington? Kunaoka Othello.
And
they were agog at the point when Desdemona's black gloved hand goes, and there were gasps in the audience. And I think they'd just never seen anything as complex or different where Desdemona, and we noticed that the notes go in 2 directions. The one side, the ones who look at it spiritually feel that she did not really attain salvation, but the ones who are thinking of it as a continuation of Shakespeare's play, and who therefore want a resolution for her in her feelings about Othello, find that that's possible, but the two desires of the audiences go in different directions,
Yes.
which is something that our notes showed.
Yeah, it's one of the, I mean, I'm part of, I should admit, I'm part of the Spirits team, writing often rather baffled notes about what happens to Shakespeare's plays in these contexts where they have become raw material for theatre traditions that have a totally different sense of the afterlife and our relation to it. The production Leila's talking about is a no play based on Othello, in which a pilgrim comes to Cyprus after the events of the play and meets Desdemona's spirit, who takes him through a kind of eternal reenactment of the tragedy with which she is trying to be released from. And we see how it happened, and the last thing she does is reenact her own murder, strangling herself with this big black glove. It's in this extraordinary, ghastly and beautiful dance. It is a remarkable piece of work, and yes, for that play to be opened up to a debate about spirituality when it's one of Shakespeare's tragedies that, in the Western tradition, is one of the ones that doesn't have ghosts. It's one of the ones that talks about religion in terms of conversion between Christianity and Islam, but which doesn't talk about salvation anything like as much as Hamlet does. But in this version, it's remarkable, and thanks to this Singapore-based project, it's able to be studied now from anywhere on the planet. Leland, what was your impetus in wanting to run a course that exploited the archive? And what's your experience of it?
Extension of the way that I use the archive to teach in Singapore.
Yeah.
But, well, it's not enough alone to make an archive. You need a pedagogy and a critical research approach that is also intercultural to match the productions. And one of the Korean partner in the archive, Professor Lee Hyun-Yu, a famous director who's just directed Lear, and I have for years held a seminar with our joint student cohorts who are jointly prepare work together in pairs for a seminar, and that sort of small start, which is now almost a tradition for us, has then expanded into a whole course. And I think the Shakespeare Institute has a strong tradition of distance learning. So I was able to leverage on a structure and an experience with distance learning that I didn't have myself for a whole course.
Yeah.
And extend the whole ASIA method, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say that at our end in Stratford, I was also drawing on the experience of having Eleine in Stratford, writing a doctorate about Shakespeare in Singapore, but doing it while being based in rural Warwickshire, accessing a lot of her research materials by digital means. I mean, some of them, many of them through ASIA, to which she too has given many hours of her life. And however you measure expertise, great quantities of that as well. It's yes, and this is. I mean, I very much hope this course will run many more times. We'll certainly be teaching it again next year. The experience of watching students who often, because the Institute has, as you say, a lot of distance learning. It's an online only course. And it has attracted students based in France, students, just within the Institute cohort, students from Japan, students from China, students from many different places, as well as England. And in Singapore, it's attracted Singapore-based students, a number of whom are from the People's Republic of China and from other places too. So we've had this great mix of perspectives and responses to the different aspects of the productions we've been studying, and to the different questions raised by the criticism we've looked at. I think it's very much a kind of only in Singapore phenomenon, the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive. It's like a sort of digitized diaspora of Shakespeare's that are all somehow on servers in Singapore.
It's a mindset of the collaborators in the Asian Shakespeare in ASIA point out that it could only happen here because of a certain mind, a certain way of thinking double or
Yes.
thinking in multiple languages all the time. My English sometimes sounds like other people's English around the world, but the big difference is it lives among other languages all the time. And so that awareness of how it might look like from a different cultural perspective, or how it translates into another language, I'm sure I unconsciously compute changes in diction and syntax all the time.
Yeah.
The archive now has 17 languages in 52 productions, and it's soon to add about 14 more. But I speak none of them except English. So that kind of collaboration across languages was something that was possible from here and could be extended into pedagogy and research.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible feat and an incredible resource, and one can't overstate the fact that some of the most exciting performances of Shakespeare of the last 50 years have been produced in Asia. I mean, and obviously global figures like Ng-Gagneux, are really only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's phenomenal work going on all around East Asia, and completely changing the paradigm of the relation between text and performance, quite apart from anything else, in all kinds of intriguing ways. Speaking of diasporas and working across languages, it's at this point in the conversation that I'm going to call on Hans-Martin Rall to switch on his camera.
Here I am.
Hello, Hannes. It's great to see you from Tübingen to Singapore. Hannes is based at Nanyang Technical University, a little to the west of the National University of Singapore, where Eleine is, and engaged in translating Shakespeare into purely digital forms with little live performance involved. You'd worked on, you've done some remarkable prize-winning animations in Germany before you ever went to Singapore, some of them based on German folklore. Why did Nanyang's pioneering Department of Digital Arts want you to do stuff on Shakespeare, or was it all your own idea to move towards Shakespeare because he is Germany's founding national dramatic poet?
Actually, the idea emerged actually from the English department at NTU. There are actually some scholars, namely Daniel Keith Jernigan, who had kind of specialized in Shakespeare, particularly in the abridged form of Shakespeare plays, was looking for a collaboration partner. And so that really matched really well with my experience in adapting other kind of famous writers, poets, and so forth, like Goethe, some people might have heard of, or Edgar Allan Poe and so forth, for animation before. So that was a match made in heaven, so to say. And then after I was told if I do something with Shakespeare, I also have to find a collaboration partner who is a real expert in Shakespeare. So one day I went to Google, typed in world famous Shakespeare scholar, and you popped up. So actually, like that basically that's how things start.
You got lucky in getting in touch with the Shakespeare Institute, less because of me than because of Erin Sullivan, who has a very developed research interest in digital Shakespeares and Shakespeare across media. She's very interested in digital Shakespeare, and I'm very interested in frequent flyer miles. So we were very keen to join in and develop work on Shakespeare in Singapore. I think you are another only in Singapore story in that, you know, your office, I can't convey to our online audience what a glitzy building you work in. This fantastic,
right. Actually, maybe I start the pictures, right? So
yes,
like
yes,
that we can also
show us some pictures, Hannes.
illustrate, you know, so okay, let me see here and make that big. So because we keep that also informal. So because like here we should have the wonderful juxtaposition.
Yes, gosh, there it is at the top.
You know, our School of Art, Design and Media at NTU, and then the Shakespeare Institute, right? And interestingly, I was looking up some of our, you know, like archived information, actually a book chapter of one of my former books, and the first interview, or one of the first interviews I conducted at the Shakespeare Institute was in 2013. So it's kind of like pretty much a decade now. I mean, almost exactly since we started the collaboration. And as you can see here, and please jump in whenever you feel with additional questions. I think what is so nice is that we are having this very fruitful collaboration between, you know, many academic fields and many different scholars, practitioners, very diverse, and also what I think is important, a high number of young research assistants from Singapore who usually come in after they finish their BFA or their master degrees, and then they would also kind of like provide a very nice feedback opportunity to allow people you know, to test what we are doing, how it resonates with the younger people, right? And so like here's just like a few excerpts from what we have been doing over the years, and it's quite a lot. And here's only the impact of the films themselves in terms of festivals, but then of course there's also countless conference presentations, book chapters, articles, journal essays, you name it.
Yeah. Do the awards for Shaking a Singapore Spear include anything for Best Actor, by the way?
Oh well, we're working on it. We're working on it, as we can see. But I figure the chances are quite high. The BAFTA is around the corner. So just to show, I mean, I think I'll just click through. I mean, what is interesting is something maybe we can point out. What we're currently working on is basically adapting one of the not so popular Shakespeare plays, which is actually a wonderful play. The more I engage with it, the more I love it. And because it's so rich and kind of like multi-layered, and kind of adapting this for VR and a game at that in addition. So it's very interesting. And then there is like, you know, this full dome adaptation of A Merchant of Venice, where we're kind of like, you know, struggling a little bit more with to find the right access, but I think we're putting the right care there, you know, so that something really nice will emerge in the end. And maybe I'm not going to show the whole film, maybe for the, you know, sake of time. And please stop me whenever I go on for too long.
No, carry on.
Just to kind of like to pick out maybe the emergence of All the World's a Stage, which as a standalone film kind of emerged of our collaboration on creating a half-hour version of As You Like It. And somehow it turned out that that film by itself was working so well as a short segment that this was kind of like the single to the LP. So it came out first and went on to quite phenomenal success with almost 200 film festivals and I think 12 awards. And not the least, maybe because of a wonderful narration by Sam West, right? who's now rose to national TV fame, and he's always been fabulous, but now probably he's have to give autographs at every street corner. So and maybe I'll just like let it run a little bit.
Yeah, let's have a bit.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like snail unwillingly to school. And then the lover, sighing like furnace, with a woeful ballad made to his mistress' eyebrow. Then a soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honour, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, in fair round belly with good capon lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all that ends this strange eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything.
So now it was a whole film.
All the world's a stage.
Okay, now, okay. So
Yeah.
what I was just going to say is just, I think, which is important to point out, that it's just such a very wonderful and fruitful collaboration there. Let's say the scholarship and the creative practice meet and create something worthwhile. Because I think a lot of input that comes, you know, also to talking to you and back in the day, Pippa Nixon, that was a wonderful input.
Yeah, yeah, and indeed your animation, your Rosalind looks a bit like Pippa, but like a Southeast Asian Pippa.
Right.
One of the interesting things about the work you've done is producing this, you know, Indonesian-looking setting for these stories, which is so beguiling and you know so fresh for many viewers. Yeah,
and I found this is a quite nice review I found actually after the screening at the World Congress, you know, where Peter Kerwin, you know, I think he kind of like very nicely summarized. I couldn't have written it better myself if I wanted to praise my own achievement. So that is quite nice. And it's really that what I find so great is there is just a lot of input that comes from negotiating Shakespeare, also in trying to understand what the work's all about that informs the plays. I just play a little bit of it.
To see my father and that excellent young man.
Rosalind.
So that gives an idea, I would say. And also what was nice about this film, because you mentioned before Shakespeare in the Park, right? And you know, like there is actually a quite huge number of very capable Shakespeare actors in Singapore, and quite a you know a high proportional percentage of them was also participating, doing the voices, the voiceover for this animation. And here you can see a certain professor paying visit to our humble facilities, and in the process also adding some great new ideas. And it's always, I think at some point we will be able to return to these times. because of course it's a nice combination of taking in the cultural richness of Singapore right here. And the other one to which came out recently is Shaking a Singapore Spear, that documentary, which basically is about asking young Singaporeans what Shakespeare means to them, and then taking these answers and nicely commenting them and translating them into animation, if you will. So like here's again a short excerpt.
What should an animated documentary about Shakespeare include?
Where Shakespeare ghosts may turn up, fairies may turn up, and Falstaff may turn up, in the middle of a famous historical Civil War battle.
Maybe one of the characters is being replaced by an animation.
Sounds great. Sounds great. I'm all for it. And I hope my words are being spoken by a frog.
So this didn't play quite smoothly, but the idea here is, I think, is clear, that is mixing live action and animation here, and then adding an additional layer of meaning, which sometimes is even factual and gives reasonable information, like really, because that is actually true, right? That Sarah Bernard and Mark Twain and Laurence Olivier came to the Institute, right?
Yeah, before it was the Institute, but even so.
But even so, right, to the building, if you will, right? And I think there was the strategy here to combine sometimes kind of like really funny or quirky commentary, but then also mixing it with real information, and all the way learning about the ideas of Singaporeans, young Singaporeans. Here's an example how somebody is transformed, what they think about Shakespeare. Does Shakespeare play a role in their lives? What do you think about Shakespeare-based education? So this has also been quite universally well received. Whenever we had these ideas, we liked it quite a bit. So I mean, I think the images kind of speak for themselves.
It's very visually rich, this one.
And then kind of coming to the other segment you mentioned that we already touched upon shortly, is basically going further with immersive media, really going into the worlds of virtual reality, and later on is also the plan to go into augmented reality. So basically immersing a viewer completely in a world there he has complete control where he looks, what he does, we decided to test this kind of like with a mashup of 3 different major Shakespeare plays, who will be all familiar, which will be all familiar here. And then you can see some of the visual development there. You start with looks you find could be appropriate by other artists, and then you transform them into your own interpretations. And here we can see that the visual development for Macbeth. And the idea was also to transpose the plays also to settings which are entirely different from the original Shakespeare setting, if any such exists, because Shakespeare plays usually would not really give an exact description of time and place. But let's say to move away from the convention in some ways. And here's just an excerpt there. One can see how a viewer might perceive that world then going into the VR itself. And basically this one is already finished, but we are still, now that we have more time with a second round of funding, we're trying to perfect it even more and more. And hopefully next year we can have a real premiere and also start sending it off. So here you can see our idea of a Tempest, which was transposed to a kind of like beach hippie idyll in the 1960s in Southern California, if you will, with the jaded beauty of some amusement park. And yeah, so like, I mean, these also, I mean, speak for themselves. Then in the Tempest, also the three witches from Shakespeare re-emerge to kind of like further the idea of this kind of like amalgamated mashup here. And just a few more nice pictures to go through. And of course, also for A Midsummer Night's Dream, the Asian idea came in, and we kind of created an kind of like an idealized or kind of mix of different time periods of Chinese art history and culture to create a fictional setting for A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I think the particular appeal of this always lies with that this is not done by Western people, if you will, but the visual development artist is, of course, a Chinese, a Singaporean artist, so like who's very much familiar with cultural traditions and so forth. So it's just also like a very quick glimpse into. This is not actually moving, so God knows why. But then it's just like a few images, which is good enough. And nearing a little bit the end, not really the end, there would be so much more to show, but there has to be an end at some point. Going a little bit more into detail with the Pericles adaptation as a serious game for virtual reality. And we found that the more you engage with Pericles, the more you find that the quite episodic and anecdotal structure of a play and the many, many locations are just wonderful for world discovery and world building, which is so crucial to successful game creation and to successful gameplay. So we try to create a very rich world there. The user can engage with the world of Pericles, understand the story, but also face challenges like he has to overcome an AI-driven opponent in a battle in a tournament, which is, of course, out of a play originally, but completely transposed to this new setting, as you can see here. And here's just like some insights, and there is actually also was the decision to move Pericles to this anthropomorphic setting, which also creates a nice contrast, if you will, between the usual notion of the anthropomorphic world to quite harmless themes, and then you still have to negotiate some kind of like heavier topics in Pericles. So that's also a very interesting aspect we're working on.
Yeah, so Disney does incest.
Well, yeah, well, so something like that, yeah. Something like that. And here's just more examples of a very nice, quite gorgeous development art by Wayang and Rachel Chen. Just wonderful to work with them, very talented young artists, and they bear with my strange ideas, and they make the best out of them. Yeah, so you can see, for example, these are settings which are inspired by kind of vintage Singaporean images, and but also from the region. So we're not really going for a concrete geography which can be nailed down in one place, but more for like a fictional overall Southeast Asian idea. So how are we doing with time? Can I still say a few words about?
Well, yeah, say a few words about Merchant, and then we will unshare.
Okay, we're almost good. Yeah, we're almost good here. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I think the Merchant of Venice is just a very particular challenge, simply because there is a history and also a history of scholarly debate to the play. And what we decided, as you probably can confirm because you are also being part of it, is that we want to be very sensitive and very kind of like responsible in terms of addressing the discussion about Jewish identity and the way the Jewish community is represented. And I think we have quite some good ideas how we can find the adequate treatment in the narrative to do that justice. Okay, so like I'll think, yeah, we're right here, so I can stop sharing.
Thank you.
Reach
Marvelous.
the finishing
Okay.
line.
Well, Leland and Eleine, if you would care to switch your cameras back on. This has been a fascinating conspectus of ways in which Singapore serves as a crossroads and a conduit. All these recordings of theatre productions which have arrived on a huge database server in Singapore so that the rest of the world can watch them and try and understand them and you know, compare notes with them. And Shakespeare's raw narrative materials arriving in Hans's studio and being mediated through the eyes of Chinese Singaporean designers to enable them to reappear in digital form anywhere in the world, and for quite different audiences and quite different constituencies. I think it's highly significant that the Singaporean government seems to have a definite policy of investing in the digital arts, you know, sees that as kind of the next stage in Singapore's development as a trading station, that it's going to be an online trading station as well in this way, and that Shakespeare as a major global cultural commodity is going to be handled in these particular ways and is going to attract expertise like yours to work on it here. Hannes, can you imagine having any of your Shakespeare animations annotated by Leland's team of experts?
Of course, that would be wonderful. Yeah, absolutely wonderful. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You know, so I think it's always been a strength, you know, of these projects, you know, that the scholarly part and the creative part, you know, they go hand in hand and go back and forth, you know, and there's a lot of cross-pollination going on, you know, which is wonderful. And to also you know, also retrospectively identify, you know, basically the specifically Singaporean input, where I'm not so sure how much Singaporean I am myself now after 17 years. So I might be very, very localized already, you know. So
well,
you know,
I mean, you must be quite significantly Singaporean because you've eaten so much Singaporean food.
Well, that's for sure. Yes, yes. It can hardly escape anybody's notice that it's been quite a lot.
Eleine, do you think there's going to be the development of a distinctively Singaporean style of Shakespearean performance, or is Singaporean Shakespeare going to continue to be marked by its hospitality to multiple other traditions that are going to remain identified with other places?
I think there will always be a mix between, you know, different kind of small-time Shakespeares and big-time Shakespeares produced by local directors as well. Just because within our local audience, that demographic as well is very different. So I think they are, with each new Shakespearean production being produced now, it is opening up to a different type of audience that like different types of Shakespearean production. So you have very you know, conventional English Shakespeare. You have multilingual or Singlish Shakespeare, and then you have also lately, I guess, more Chinese Shakespeare, Chinese language Shakespeare as well. But there's always been a very strong history in Singapore of having, you know, multiracial casts and multilingual Shakespeare already, you know, even in the 60s, there was like a Tamil Shakespeare, for instance.
Mm.
So this has always been part of, you know, the history of making Shakespeare in Singapore. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a place that has always had a multicultural Shakespeare and is now able to export that, or able to export even some techniques that have enabled that to elsewhere. Leland, do you kinds of Shakespearean production from Singapore itself do you have in the archive?
We have both what Eleine calls the small time and the big time.
Mm.
Of course, the best known Singaporean director is Ong Keng Sen.
Mm.
We have those in the archive, which are sort of were a radical intercultural move, which he said was in response to Peter Brook, was his answer to Peter Brook, because each actor acts and speaks in their own tradition and language. But sometimes I like the small ones as well, like Nanyang Nightingale, which are really about not explicitly having each actor speak and act differently, but it's about a Peranakan culture, which is a mix of, which is itself a hybridized culture already. And that's like a kind of short production for children to teach them about Peranakan culture. The important thing is that English is still a kind of major lingua franca, the way it's not in other British colonies, ex-British colonies like Hong Kong and the other Straits settlements. So there's a mix of, you know, what you might call actually a real understanding of Shakespeare in English, and then the other languages mixing and cultures mixing in as well.
That's grand. And we are running out of time. Anyone who has a question or even just a comment, as long as it's a polite comment, is very free to type it into the chat or into the Q&A while we are still here in our different time zones. I should perhaps advertise the next session in this series of Shakespeare Beyond Borders Alliance events today, that in 90 minutes, I'm currently in Romania, which is as close as I'm currently allowed to get to our colleagues in Ukraine. And I will be talking to those of them who can get online from Romania at 3 o'clock UK time. Which will be 5 o'clock where I am. Nobody seems to have any questions, which means that, you know, you've given such informative and lucid presentations full of insight that you've clearly satisfied our online public. You know, perhaps they've already, you know, logged on to the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, or already looking for places online where they can watch Hanny's work and you know, often investigating for themselves. Here's Jennifer Lazarek. Yep, good. She's comments that ASIA has been an absolute lifesaver for her teaching Shakespeare in China, you know, and particularly in non-metropolitan bits of China. That's very good to hear. Yeah. Isaac Chong, an enthusiast for the shared online course we run, and indeed teaching assistant on it, expresses his customary enthusiasm, for which we're very, very grateful. But at 12:30 in my laptop's time zone, it's time to close this session. Do spend lots of time on the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive. It really will expand your sense of how Shakespeare crosses borders and how technology can enable Shakespeare to cross many, many more. Enormous thanks to our guests in Singapore, Professor Leland Yong, Dr. Eleine Ng-Gagneux, and Professor Hans-Martin Rall.